Hi guys, my name's Pete. I work under the label Pete Sews out of my studio in Coolum Beach in Queensland. I'd like to thank you all for coming and having a look at this presentation. I'd like to thank the Australian Sewing Guild for allowing this opportunity to happen and to be part of the Autumn Sewing Celebration. It's really wonderful to be able to share our skills and our knowledge across this community all around Australia. What I do is create bespoke menswear. All the pieces that I create are one-off and unique. I don't work on stock, I don't fill shops, I work purely to order. What I like to do is help people to make a statement with their clothing, particularly their shirts. So I work with unique fabrics, I work with the designs that people like, I work with the colours and styles that people would prefer. And a big part of what I do is add little features and details. So today we're going to have a look at some of those things that you might like to add to some of your sewing and the techniques that I use to do that. We're going to add a detail stripe onto a collar. We're going to turn a collar. And also I'm going to show you guys how I sew down the rabbit hole. The process of felling a seam from the waist all the way through the underarm and down to the end of the cuff. It's something that a lot of people get nervous about. They don't really understand, but having practiced it quite a few times, it's not that difficult. You just need to go a little bit slowly, go a little bit carefully, and you'll find it'll come together without too much hassle. So we'll get that one done as well. To start with, what I've got is I've got this nice collar cut out, ready to go. And I'm going to put a little bit of a detail stripe out of a good contrasting fabric. And that detail is going to come in on the left-hand collar point. Cool. All right, so for putting our contrast stripe on, I've got my collar piece prepared here. I've got my strip of contrast. I've got a bias tape maker. I use my awl quite a bit because it's better than burning my fingers. Piece of tailor's chalk, ruler and pins. First of all, I'm going to mark my 1 centimetre seam allowance. So I'm going to mark my stitching line on my fused piece of collar here. It really just helps to keep things a little bit more accurate, to mark your seam allowances on where you're actually going to sew. It does make it a little bit easier when it comes to the actual sewing time. So we just do a quick little 1 centimetre all around the edge of that. I'm marking in from the edge of the blue, like that. So that's where I'm actually going to sew. Next up, I'm going to make my contrast stripe. Now, bias tape making, pretty easy to do. Get your piece. I've got a 12mm bias tape maker, so I've cut 24mm strip. It's a lot longer than I need because it's easier to cut it off afterwards. I've trimmed the corners off, just makes it a little bit easier to feed into here. Slide that up into your bias tape maker. Use your awl. Kick that forward a little bit more. Whoop. Nope. Slide it up into your bias tape maker. Go a little bit slower there, Pete. And then it comes out the other end. I like to pin this straight into my ironing board. Just helps hold it in place. I use glass-headed pins so I can iron straight over the top of them. Get it set up nicely at the beginning and then just chase your bias tape maker with your iron all the way up, occasionally having a little peek there to make sure that it's going nice and straight, checking how it's going in the other end to make sure that it's going in straight. That means it'll come out nice and straight. Plenty of steam will help press that down. This is just a piece of calico, so it does press down really nicely, but some fabrics obviously are a little bit harder to use. Now we need to place this one in the right position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop a pin straight through that corner. Let's just double check that that's the corner that I want it on. So it's going to sit around my neck like this. It's going to come, the points are going to come down this way. I want this on the left-hand side, so I'm going to go to the other corner. Always check it. Going to pop that in right there because that's where I want it to be. Your pin comes through and you can see it on the other side. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this straight over the top of that pin, and then I'm going to decide on the angle that I want. Just a matter of fashion. I'm going to go with a slightly steeper angle today, and then what I'm going to do is just pin that right on the corner and right on the edge there, and then I'm going to pin the other one just there, and just there. Now, depending on the fabric that you're using, this could be something that's contrasting with a piece of pattern that's already on the print. It could be something that's complementing it. You might want to put a second piece in, depending on how your eye is feeling, how your style's looking. What I'll often do is I'll often come in and just make sure that it's sitting nice and straight. Yeah, because sometimes the fabric can bunch up a little bit. So use your ruler. It's always worth checking. You can see it's kind of hanging out a little from the side there. So I might even pop a third pin in just in the middle there to make sure that it stays nice and straight. Take your time to get those details correct before you start putting a stitch in, because when you have to take these things back out again, it'll usually leave a line of holes in your collar piece. So I've got that all sorted and ready to go. Time to hit the machine. Cool. All right, so we're just going to place this right on the edge underneath our needle. Now, if you need to check what's going on where you are, put the needle down, guide it in there, and just have a nice close look. And yeah, that's right on the edge. Set your stitch length a little bit shorter. I go just under 2 mil for the stitch length on this. You can put a back tack in. You don't really need to, because we are going to then seal this up by stitching the other piece of collar in there. So I'm going to go right through, so straight over the top of my pins, just going nice and slow so that I'm staying consistent with the edge. Rather than starting again, I just sew across the edge of there. And then I'm going to come back up the other side. One more stitch up there, get me nice and close to the edge. Now when I'm coming up, even though I'm concentrating on the edge, I'm not watching the needle. What I'm looking at is where the edge of my contrast piece is sitting in relation to my foot. That's what I'm watching, is whereabouts is the edge of that foot and where is the edge of that contrast piece. Trim your edges off, pull your pins out, give it a little press, and there you can see we've got a nice detailed contrast stripe across the point of our collar. Now it's time to make our collar. What we can do first up, we'll just cut the ends of this off. It doesn't matter if they're a little bit long still, because we're going to trim it off after we've put our collar together. So I've got a contrasting collar piece. This is going to be my under collar, and then I've got my over collar is the blue one. So making sure that we put our right sides together. Now for this technique, I'm going to show you 2 ways that I like to turn a collar. I'll show you one way on one point and one on the other point. So first of all, I just pin along this edge, right? I don't pin along the long edge and I don't pin the other edge. I'm just going to pin along here, and I'll show you why in a moment. Back to the machine. Now we previously marked our stitch line, so I know where I'm going to sew and I know where my corner piece is going to be here. So for this technique, what we're going to do is we're going to sew right up here to the corner. We're going to come to a stop just before that turn. We're going to put our stitch length right down, and we're going to actually put 2 diagonal stitches in there to then join up with this line. And those 2 diagonals, it's going to help reduce some of the bulk that's in here. Then we're going to go straight along to the other end. Now, because I want to show you 2 different techniques, I'm going to do something different here. But normally, I would just do the same thing here. I'd slow right down, I'd put in 2 diagonal stitches, and then go down this way. But I'll show you something else when we get over there. Again, get as accurate as you can onto that nice pink line there. If you need to, check with your needle. Yep, we're bang on. This time I am going to put a back tack in, just over 2 millimeters stitch to come up the edge here. This is the time that you can actually watch your pink line. You can watch your stitch line. Bring it right down to a 1 mil stitch as you approach the corner here. If you need to, just wheel a couple of stitches in. I'm going to get really close in there. Then I come across to a diagonal, 1, 2 like that, and I should be back on my pink line ready to go. Now, because we want our undercollar to be ever so slightly smaller, all I do is I just slide the over collar up a little bit, and then I stretch it out. So I'm actually stretching out the undercollar a little, and that'll help it tuck underneath when I turn the points out. So we get away from that corner, come back up to just over 2mm stitch length, and all we do is going along following that line. Now I'm holding tight here so that it's staying a little bit stretched, and then we go again. We match up our raw edges, stretch the undercollar out a little tiny bit. Just got to check my raw edge there in the middle. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew straight past the edge here and off the end, and I'll show you a different technique. So we can see here it's all a little bit puckered up there because I've stretched out that undercollar. So that's ready for the next part of this process. What we do here, get a little piece of a very different coloured thread. So I'm using blue and white fabric, so I'm going to use a red thread here. Just cut off a length, take a bite. What we want to do is we want to put our middle of that thread, right, the fold that we made, and we want to tuck this inside that seam. So I open that seam right up, and again we can do this on both ends if you wanted to, and we tuck this right in there with our little loop just poking out the edge. Whoops. Tuck that right in there with our little loop just poking out the edge, and then we fold that back over. So what I've now got, if you can get in nice and close, we can see I've got my red loop coming out there. I've got those ends, we don't worry about them, we'll trim them off afterwards. That red loop's going to help us pull the collar point in the other way. So now we go back to the machine. Once again, right on the pink line, we're going to start back in the seam allowance of that long seam that I did along the edge of the collar. Check we're in the right spot. Yep, got a good stitch length. Let's shorten that up a little bit. Do a little back tack. Now right where the two threads are going to cross over, I'm going to do a back tack over that as well, because that's going to help reinforce that point. I'm making sure that these two edges, even though they're not matched, they're remaining parallel. And they're not matched because I've stretched out that undercollar, but at least they're parallel, so it's the same along this side. And then I come down this way, and a little back tack down there. Now we need to trim all of these excess off our seam allowance. This end's a little bit tricky. You've got to make sure you don't cut those red threads, otherwise your whole technique's gone. So I just eyeball so that I'm cutting down to about 3 or 4 millimeters. I cut right up near that red thread, and then if I pull that down this way, hold that red thread back over there, and then I can cut that off. Trim off your corners diagonal. Now because we did our little back tack over the stitch there, you can get relatively close in there. All the way up the long side. Once again, I'm just eyeballing where my three to 4 millimeters is there. Now here, if we had our red thread, we'd have to be conscious of that. But what we've got here is we've got our little diagonal turn. So I'm going to get in nice and close to that. There's a bit of extra bulk here because of our contrast piece, which means that that collar point is not going to be quite as sharp because of that extra bulk. But that's just the nature of sewing like this. All right, so now it's time to turn it over. This one here, we can just use our point turner. All my shears, just like that. And we just carefully work that out. Just push it out gently, gently, so that we get our nice point out there, as sharp as we would like it to be. So that's about as much as we're going to get out of there, because we've got that extra bulk in there. When we press that into place, it'll come up a lot better. With our other one, what we can actually do is we can do a little bit of the turning ourselves manually like that, but then you'll find that when you grab these two red threads, oh no. So sometimes this happens and then we are no good. What's happened here, guys, is I've got both of these red threads through the one stitch line. So occasionally that happens, no real cause for alarm, we just need to turn it in the manual way. What would happen here is that would pull the corner out. So I'm really sorry that didn't work. It's probably about a 1 in 10 when that happens. So I'm just going to go back to the regular old school way. All right, now we just press. Now I always start in the middle and press my way out. You can see I sort of roll those edges back, just trying to get it so that it's ever so slightly got the outer collar poking over the inner collar. Because if we're doing a contrast, we want that inner collar to be hidden until we get little sneak peeks of it, but not right there. So I always start from the middle and I press my way out towards the edges. And what you'll then find is by starting from the middle and pressing your way out, because we stretched out that inner collar, what we can end up with is a nice sharp outer collar there. Maybe a tiny bit of an extra roll under there. We'll get that one sorted out. Now often this would be a time to put a top stitch on, put a top stitch or an edge stitch or something like that to hold all of that together. So that's how I put that detail stripe in there on the collar, and that's how I turn my collar points. All right, next part I'd like to show you guys is I love doing a felled seam. I think they look really neat and tidy. They look much more professional than doing an overlocked seam, particularly up the underarms. Felling seams around the arm sear where the sleeve goes in, it is possible. It's quite tricky and does take a lot of practice, but worth doing if you want that really top-notch finish on your shirts. I've worked out a technique for doing this. I don't use a felling foot. I just use my straight stitching foot, and then I eyeball it pretty much most of the time. So what I've done here is I've prepared half a shirt. The front part is blue and the back part is white. That way you can see really clearly which part is which as we go through this process. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to iron a little edge of the whole of the back. So I lay out, this is the back of the shirt coming up to the underarm seam here and then all the way out to the cuff around there. This will probably have to be done in 2 bits because my ironing board's not quite big enough. What I do, I eyeball this, okay? You can use a measurer if you want to. So we might do it like this one, and we're just going for around about 5 millimeters, okay? So if you want to use a tool like this is a great little ruler that I've got here. We just start off with our 5 millimeter measurement there, and we can come in 5 millimeters, move your iron forward, 5 millimeters, move your iron forward, 5 mil, move your iron forward, so on and so forth. As I say, I usually just eyeball this. I often don't measure, but since everybody's watching, let's do it properly, Peter. All right, take your time to get that done properly. There'll be a little bit of extra bulk as you get to your underarm. So it doesn't matter if it's not exactly your 5 mil. So we can see we've pressed a little tiny edge all the way there. Now that's pressed over towards the right side. This is the right side of the fabric, and that's pressed over that way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my piece over so that my sleeve is closed. You can see my sleeve's closed there. I've got my seam allowance of my arm sear facing over in the same direction as it is on the back part, and then the front part's going to go in and match up down there as well. So I begin here and I match up my, just going to trim off that little excess bit of seam allowance there. Just makes it a little bit tidier like that. Right, I'm going to wriggle this in and just underneath the part that I just folded over. Yeah, just like that. So I just wriggle a little bit in underneath there so that the raw edge of my front, which is the blue, is matched up with where I've just pressed under there. Okay, and that's what I want to do. Now, if you want to, and particularly while you're beginning, I'd recommend pinning this one in place. So if you go through and pin all the way down those edges, it'll hold it in place for you. Okay, I must have done this 100 times, so I don't pin it. So I do this in 2 goes. I start from the underarm and I go down towards the waist, the hem, and then I come back from the underarm and I go again. Now what I'm aiming for here is I'm stitching just off the edge of where the back is folded. So I'm just going to stitch into the blue there and allow, if you do catch a little bit of the white, that's okay, but we're aiming just to stitch right down that edge. So that's giving us a 5mm stitch. Just over 2 millimeter stitch length for this one. And so then we just keep going, tucking this in underneath that edge there. Tuck that in underneath that edge there. Keep that edge folded over. It does get tricky depending on how deep your waistline is. If you do need to stop and reassess, often needle down is the easiest way to do it, depending on the setup of your individual machine. Now these don't quite match up down here because this is just a mock-up. I haven't bothered trimming the bottoms up correctly, but normally these 2 points would match up here. I may even already have my bottom hem done. But all that's for another day. Little back tack at the bottom there. So then we come back up. Now I know that this is sewing around the other side of the needle, but because I don't need to focus on seam allowance, I just get those edges tucked in underneath there. Start from where your stitch was last time. You can hear the dogs having a little play in the background, having a lovely time out there in the sunshine while I'm in here. So just off the edge of that fold that we've got, poke that underneath there a little bit more. Okay, so we've got that seam, we've got our garment folded over right sides together, and we've stitched all the way up to the underarm and then all the way down to the point of the sleeve there. So now what we need to do is we need to be able to iron, we need to be able to press this seam back over. Now, because I make a lot of shirts, I've built myself this nice sleeve board purposely for this, but I'll show you how to do it on the flat ironing board as well, in case that's just what you've got. So all I do is I slide the whole garment up onto here. The sleeve is out there ready to go. And just I work it down over my sleeve board like this. All right. And then we've just got to get our iron and we're just pressing this over towards the front so that our raw edges are both hidden underneath. And I'm pulling the fabric apart so it gets it nice and tight. Plenty of steam. Again, we're going to get a little bit of the puckering at the waistline there. So if a flat ironing board is all you've got, the main body of the shirt is really quite easy to do because you can just open it out in a couple of sections. So I'll do the bottom part as I would press there. I did plenty of them like this before I built myself my sleeve board. And then the upper part just up there like that, making sure that we're pressing it over towards the front. Now the sleeve is a little harder if this is all you've got. What you need to do is, I recommend putting your arm up the sleeve here and opening it out and flattening it so that your felled seam is sitting right there on top. Now, just to make it easier for your future self, and you will thank yourself for this, try to keep the rest of the sleeve smooth underneath, because otherwise you're going to press a great big crease straight into the upper part of your sleeve. So again, working the fabric apart with my fingers, making sure that I'm pressing towards the front part so that it's consistent with what's happening everywhere else. And go right up to the underarm there. Okay, so that whole seam sitting there ready to go. Now we get to sew down the rabbit hole. What you've got to do is you've now got to turn the sleeve in the right way. So reach right through to the cuff, pull it right through in the right way. And this is what we're going to do, is we're actually going to sew one seam. Oh, let me get this around the right way for the camera here. We're going to sew one seam all the way from the hem up to the underarm and then down to the cuff. Right, get our machine going, sort out your tail threads. What we're going to do here is we're just going to line up the edge of this, and this is really handy having this in two easy contrast colors so you can see. That folded edge, we want to be just on the inner edge of my foot there, depending on your setup of your sewing machine and your foot, but we want to stitch just inside that nice creased line there. So do a little back tack to begin with. Take your time, go slowly. As I say, I've done a lot of these. Steady around the little bend of the waist there. Oh, there's the rabbit hole. Here it comes. All right, get up to your underarm, put your needle down and get yourself set up. So what you want to do is you want to open this out. You want to make sure that you've got no other parts of your shirt coming in underneath. Open this right out here. Hold your felled seam down there and just do a little bit at a time. Stitch up to your fingers, pop your needle down to help hold it in place. You might have an automatic machine, the needle can go down straight away. That would be easy, wouldn't it? And then we just set ourselves up again. As we get closer and closer to the cuff, further down the rabbit hole, you'll find that you get more and more fabric. It's all about dealing with this fabric. You can see it's coming up the back of the foot there. That's cool, it's sewing in that direction. So we just get ourselves set up there again. We come through, set ourselves up. So you're just sewing that little 5 or 6 centimeters at a time. Nice and close to the edge, 5 or 6 centimeters, get yourself set up. As you get closer and closer to the edge, we've got more and more fabric building up. It's getting trickier, but we're nearly there. So now I'm down to sewing shorter pieces because I've got more bulk to deal with. I've got more fabric to be managing. Oh, and here I am at the end. Now I need to take my fingers off to do my little back tack there. And then we are done. We cut our threads, pull our whole thing out, check it, press it. So let's have a look. Get all of that bulk out of there. And there is my very nicely felled seam all the way through from the hem all the way through to the cuff. If you want to turn it inside out and have a look, it looks very similar on the inside. We can see our 2 lines of stitching just there. Makes it nice and tidy, no scratchy overlocking under your underarm. Really nice and neat. Gives your shirts a good professional finish to them. So all we do now, we slip that back over our sleeve board or flat on your ironing board and give it a quick press just to finish it up. So here you go, there's your sleeve all sorted out. Nice felled seam all the way from our hem all the way up through our underarm and right up to our cuff point. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Really appreciate the interest in the precision sewing that I do. I'll be around for an hour or so ready to answer any questions that you might have in regards to the sorts of things that I do and how I do them, or these particular techniques. Feel free to hit me up on the social medias, Pete Sews, or on my website or emails, pete@petesews. I really love working with people from all over Australia, helping them with their sewing, but also creating really special bespoke heirlooms. Have a look at that. That's where I incorporate something sentimental into a new garment. So yeah, thanks very much to the Australian Sewing Guild for this opportunity. Enjoy the rest of the Autumn Sewing Celebration. It's a wonderful time to get into your sewing room and create some really special things. Thanks very much for your attendance, guys. I look forward to seeing you all around the digital sphere very soon. Cheers.